What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner with The Robust Opposition, and I'm here with Zach Carter, and he is the senior reporter for the Huffington Post covering the economy. How you doing, Zach?
Well, I'm doing the best I can, I think, considering the disaster that's unfolding here.
Yeah, I know a lot of us have friends who are losing their jobs or they're losing their livelihood if they work for themselves. I was just speaking with a friend of mine yesterday who does auto trade shows, and she and her husband were both furloughed. All of the current shows have either been canceled or postponed. The trainings for those shows have been canceled. There's such a ripple effect, and we remember this with the auto bailout after the last economic collapse. Can you give an overview of how you think this is going to affect the economy in general? I mean, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are saying that we should brace for 24 to 30% unemployment, which is like Great Depression levels.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, those estimates are in some respects overly optimistic. I can't predict the future. This is a crisis filled with uncertainty, but the way things appear to me at this moment, most of the Wall Street economists right now are predicting a huge decline in GDP and a huge drop in employment over the next quarter, but they're also predicting a very rapid bounce back in the fourth quarter. So they see this sort of as a passing storm that will be very severe, that the economy will essentially be able to readjust to once it's gone. I don't think that's right. I think the type of crisis that we're seeing in the realm of medical equipment, for instance, represents the type of problem that we're going to have in other sectors of the economy. Right now, the United States cannot get key medical supplies to medical professionals treating patients at the front line of this crisis. They can't get those supplies to people because we just don't make very many of them in the United States, and other countries who are also dealing with the same problems that we are hoarding those supplies domestically. So even if production increases, it's not obvious that the production will find its way to the United States. And I think we're going to see that problem repeated in other sectors. It's not just going to be a medical disaster in the United States. There's all sorts of stuff that requires, the basic sort of operation of society needs, which isn't just about the movement of money, but it's about the movement of real resources. And I think the global supply chains that have been built over the last 30 years or so are just simply unprepared for a shock of this nature. And so when individual countries need to treat domestic emergencies, the trading system is going to break down. And so I think we're going to be looking at years of economic turmoil from this, not just a matter of months.
Now let's talk about the stock market, because we've long said that the stock market doesn't really reflect the real economy for most people, most working people. We see that after a deep decline when this coronavirus started, the stock market has rebounded quite a bit. I mean, these last 2 days of trading, it's probably regained half of its losses over the last month. Business press are speculating that Jerome Powell is the most activist Fed president that we've had, Fed chairman that we've had. He's throwing, everything that he has in terms of monetary policy. We've seen the government and the bailouts, which we've had so far, which we'll be discussing in a minute, throwing, trillions at this. Do you think that that is enough to supersede what you just talked about? Or do you think that the stock market is just rebounding because, as they say, institutional investors are rebalancing their portfolios, or short sellers are covering their bets?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, first, the stock market can be wrong. it's wrong all the time. If the stock market were always right, it wouldn't have needed to plunge as the coronavirus crisis had unfolded in the United States. Anybody reading the front page of the New York Times for the past 4 months could see that something bad was about to happen, particularly in New York City. If markets were perfectly rational, they would have seen that coming. They could be right now, they could be wrong, who knows? But the broader point is that there's a difference between what the stock market measures, which is financial flows to shareholders, and the actual movement of real resources in the economy. Jerome Powell is, in fact, being very, very aggressive in battling this crisis. I have plenty of critiques about the way he's battling it, but a lot of money is going out the door to large corporations and to the financial system to support it in this mess. I think that money is necessary. I think there should be more strings attached to it. We can get into all of that later. But just getting money to these institutions will only help keep their doors open and make sure that people keep getting paid there. It will not make sure, for instance, that masks get manufactured and sent to people on the front lines. It will not make sure that the actual movement of goods and services in the economy continues if global supply chains break down. So it could be the case that investors are quite reasonably feeling optimistic because they're going to get access to money, and that the real economy will still have a shortage of actual resources and supplies, which will keep people from getting back to work.
Yeah. Now, in a recent article, you said, quote, "Our government is so committed to serving the wealthy few that it cannot respond effectively even to a once-in-a-century crisis for the unmoneyed millions." In another article, you said, "It represents a transfer of wealth and power to the super rich from the rest of us, with the support of both political parties, a damning statement about the condition of American democracy," unquote. Give us an overview of the last bailout package, the goodies in there for corporations and the wealthy, why it was not sufficient to meet the nature and scope of the crisis, and why you say it is an indictment on our democracy.
Sure. So the key feature of the coronavirus rescue package that Congress passed a couple of weeks ago is this $500 billion fund featuring corporate aid for essentially anybody who asks for it. $500 billion is really understating the scope of this program. It's $500 billion that's allocated by Treasury, which can then be leveraged 10 times over by the Federal Reserve. So we're really looking at $4.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. I think this is a multi-trillion-dollar crisis, so it is important to get numbers like that on the table, but you cannot put that money on the table without strings attached. There is no restriction, for instance, on corporate dividends that can be paid. So companies can get this money directly from the United States government and continue funneling it out the door to their shareholders in dividends. Congress did not put any restrictions on that capacity in the bill. There's a temporary restriction on stock repurchases, which are stock buybacks, an effort to boost the value of a company's shares, essentially a transfer of wealth to shareholders. But that's a very temporary restriction. It's you could get a loan from the federal government, hold off on buybacks for a month, pay the loan back, and then get back to repurchasing your shares. So there aren't meaningful restrictions on what corporations can do with this money. What human beings got from this deal, rather than corporations, is a one-time $1,200 payment for families making less than $75,000 a year, and an increase in unemployment benefits of about $600 a month or a week for the next 4 months. These are nice things. They're not nothing, but they're totally inadequate for the scope of this crisis. We are clearly going to be dealing with double-digit unemployment for a very long time. 4 months of additional aid is not going to cut it. There should have been some sort of attempt to grapple with the actual crisis, a long-term crisis facing working people, making sure that their paychecks continued to come in and that their bills would continue to be paid. Congress didn't really do that. They threw a little bit of money at the problem, but you could have just required corporations, for instance, to maintain their payrolls and then paid for it. It would have cost a lot of money, but that's the sort of thing you could have done if you were just looking at working people.
And didn't they do that in another country?
I believe some other countries have tried this approach or rolling that out. I mean, it is an expensive process, so it's not nothing. But this is going to be an expensive process regardless. And I think instead of throwing the money at the corporations sort of from the top, it makes more sense to put it in from the bottom up. and make sure that bills are continuing to be paid and things like that. You know, if we give all of this money to big banks and they have an essentially unlimited supply of funds coming from the Fed, for instance, the banks don't have any reason to go easy on the people who owe the banks money. They can continue to squeeze people for debts and things like that because they're still getting their money on the other end. They're not going to go bankrupt if they have access to unlimited funds from the government.
Right.
We actually saw that essentially happen during the 2008-2009 bailouts with the foreclosure process, right? These companies got access to all of this federal money, and instead of cutting homeowners a break on foreclosures, they actually engaged in all sorts of illegal schemes to kick people out of their homes and squeeze them for additional payments. Ended up paying over $20 billion in settlements to the federal government for this type of activity. So I think we've set ourselves up for a lot of corporate malfeasance. And the bigger issue is that in these crises, whether it's a crisis caused by Wall Street malfunctioning or misbehavior, or from a disease like this, or from a war, what tends to happen is consolidation, corporate consolidation. So you have fewer companies at the end of this because it is the nature of an economic crisis that companies fail, and it is the smaller companies that fail first. When we think about who's really getting hit the hardest right now, it's all those small businesses, retailers, restaurants, places that people go shopping where nobody is shopping anymore. These places operate with pretty tight margins. When money stops coming in the door, they have to shut down. So when those institutions shut down, bigger institutions have an opportunity to expand their market share. And this will give those institutions greater power over both the people who they hire and also other companies downstream from them. So you end up with a higher concentration of power and wealth in fewer companies. And I think long-term, that's just a disaster for the American economic project and also, frankly, the American political project. We already live in an era of unprecedented and escalating inequality. And our government clearly is having trouble responding to the needs of actual human beings. Over the last 2 years, real life expectancy in the United States has declined for the first time since World War I. First time in a century, actual life expectancy is declining, and it's declining due to a whole lot of what doctors and experts call deaths of despair, opioid addiction, overdoses, alcoholism, things that suggest that things are really not right in the United States right now. And our political system just isn't responding to those problems. Or when it does respond, it responds as sort of an afterthought, or, okay, people are gonna get really mad if we don't send them $1,200 checks, if we send all of these trillions of dollars to Wall Street. They view the financial problem and the problem facing elites as the most pressing issue. The problem for everybody else is sort of, what you have to do to grease the wheels for the stuff that really matters. And I think that's only going to get worse.
Well, you probably read the book, Winner Take All Politics, How Washington Makes the Rich Richer and Turns Its Back on the Middle Class by Paul Piercy and Jacob Hacker 10 years ago, where they said that it's not globalization, it's not robotization, it's not computerization, it's policy, things that Washington does to benefit the rich and things that it does not do that would help the middle class. So, we have a politician now running for president, although you'd never know if you follow the mainstream corporate media, and that is Bernie Sanders. And you recently said, in speaking about Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, quote, "The fiercest lions on the left acted like mewing kittens." And I agree with you. I'm a huge Bernie Sanders supporter. I was a super volunteer in 2015-16. I ran LA for Bernie and I was a delegate, but I was very disappointed that he voted yes for this package. I mean, I knew why he did it, because he's running for president, and if he voted no, he would be pilloried even more than he already is by people saying, oh, he's holding up your $1,200 check, he's holding up your unemployment insurance. I think that if he weren't running for president, he might have made that one lone courageous vote against it, and it would have gone down in history with his other lone courageous votes. So I want to know if you agree with that opinion, and more broadly, how you think Bernie has been dealing with the bailout.
Well, look, I haven't been privy to private talks between Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders. I have a lot of respect for both Senator Sanders and Senator Warren. I think they both ran very good campaigns. And I think sort of philosophically, narratively, they did a good job refocusing the the focus of Democratic Party politics on working people rather than on the silly things that Democrats in Washington focus on every day, which is like civility and how how well Democrats get along with Republicans and things like that, which I just don't think are actually relevant to the way ordinary people process politics or even the way they think about them. But that said, I don't think either of them acquitted themselves very well in this crisis. I think they thought small. I don't think they negotiated very hard. If you're talking about getting an expansion of unemployment benefits to gig workers, that's not bad. That's fine. But if you're running for president on an alternative vision of how the American economic and political system is supposed to function, I'm sorry, that's not a transformative vision. That's asking for crumbs while hosting a feast for Wall Street. That's exactly the sort of deal that Sanders has been, and Warren, frankly, have been decrying on the campaign trail. Not just this year, but for their entire careers. I think, in particular, even if you were going to vote for this bill, even if you did say, "All right, I'll take too much flack if I vote against it," you could at least stand up during the negotiation processes and explain why you think this is a bad way of doing things and explain why you're going to vote for it anyway. At no point during these talks, which went on for almost a week, did either Senator Warren or Senator Sanders stand up and say, "You know what, this isn't the way we should do things. This is a fundamentally broken way of rescuing society from a crisis." And both of them, frankly, are capable of knowing better. I mean, Warren was on the oversight committee for the 2008-2009 bank bailouts. She's probably the most respected expert on financial rescues in the Democratic Party, and she just sat silent while this was going on, and sent out a few tweets after it had gone through. Bernie made this big floor speech about how he was going to vote against it if a few senators in the Republican Party didn't back away from plans to boost unemployment benefits a little bit. I mean, I think that was almost dishonest as a matter of political spectacle. I mean, okay, so you might vote against it if these other guys vote against it. There are serious problems with the package other than random things that Lindsey Graham says about it. This ultimately passed 96-0.
Yeah.
This is a failure not only of the Republican Party, not only of the Democratic Party establishment, but of the leaders on the American left who are representing progressives in Washington.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Pelosi voted, AOC voted for it, the whole squad voted for it. Didn't they all vote for it too in the House side?
The House side is more complicated because there wasn't a formal roll call vote. Part of the way that this was processed was that Pelosi got a quorum to hold a voice vote, and then just said the ayes have it, essentially. So we don't have a detailed accounting of who voted for what in the House. But I mean, look, there was also, when that was happening, Thomas Massie, who's a conservative Republican, stood up and said, "Hey, we should have a roll call vote for this. This is important legislation. We can't just say the ayes have it and have Pelosi declare it passed." He was largely pilloried by Democrats for saying that. I think that was a mistake on the side of the Democrats there. Thomas Massie might believe in all sorts of wacky things, but asking members of Congress to actually vote for something of this level of consequences is not unreasonable. And the excuse that Pelosi gave for why they couldn't hold a vote is because everybody was out of town.
Yeah.
But the only reason you can't vote for it when everybody's out of town is because the speaker herself had opposed remote voting. So nobody in this crisis has been addressing either the process of addressing crises or the crisis in front of us. They've looked at this as a problem for getting money out the door, and they haven't looked beyond, writing checks as a solution. I think that's a really profound failure of leadership. Yeah,
you mentioned remote voting. One of my viewers asked me to ask you about that. I presume you're in favor of it.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm in favor of remote voting for ordinary people voting for their elected representatives. I'm in favor of it for members of Congress and the Senate. We cannot have our legislature shut down during a pandemic just because people don't know how to use the internet.
Right. I think it also has to do with in California, we have the Brown Act and transparency. And that I did a show with a state legislator about why they have not yet gone to remote meetings for the state legislature. And it actually there's some state constitutional impediments to it. But moving along, Have you been following the implementation of the last package? Can you talk about bottlenecks in getting direct payments, small business loans, and unemployment insurance?
Sure. I mean, and to be clear here, I've been following, the news here on this. I haven't been reporting on it myself, so I'm just delivering you the opinion of a well-read news junkie here. Not this is not my journalistic, unique vision. But look, the way that we provision unemployment benefits in the United States, the federal government can, make an appropriation as it did in this bill, but states actually administer them. And one of the big problems is that people applying for these unemployment benefits on state websites have just completely overrun and crashed state websites. We've never had this type of, I think 10 million people lost their jobs in 2 weeks, and those are probably not even the worst of the numbers. There's a week long delay in reporting them, so it's probably, it's a horrifying number. And in some states, like a state like Nevada, where everybody is in the service economy, these states have just been completely overwhelmed with not only work, but just technologically unable to process the number of claims. So there have been delays in getting checks to people, even with this $600 a week improvement that Congress has authorized. So that's been one problem. Another one is on the small business side. There was $350 billion in money allocated specifically for small businesses. I think there's a problem in the way small businesses are defined. The bill says basically any institution with 500 or fewer employees is a small business. I think that alone is a little bit shady, but it also says 500 or fewer employees per location. So if you have multiple branches, there are all sorts of chains, restaurants, hotels, whatever, that could, conceivably qualify for this money, which I don't think is very well designed. But beyond that, people just haven't been able to get their hands on the money. There are not clear guidelines from the Treasury Department about how to deal with these things, how to process these claims. So money, even though this money has been appropriated, it's not actually going out the door to these small businesses. And timing is extremely important. There's a huge difference, between doing heart surgery on a patient, when they're having a heart attack, and doing it a month later after they've died. If you have, these businesses aren't getting access to money now. Their cash flows have stopped because their customers are not coming in the door. So they need money soon. If they do not get money, they will have to shut their doors. And if they have to shut their doors, it won't matter that you were able to send the owner a check after he's lost the business and moved out. So I think that is a pretty serious debacle, and frankly, quite damning for Congress. Congress clearly knew they had to get money to small businesses, but they didn't bother to think about how to do it. They just said, here, let's leave it to the Trump administration to figure this stuff out. Okay, well, particularly if you're Democrats, Democrats literally impeached President Trump a couple months ago because they believed that he was improperly withholding congressionally mandated aid for political gain. You have to at least put some strings attached to it. You could design a program. What's so frustrating about all this is that we went through this process in 2008 and 2009 with the bank bailouts. We know exactly what went wrong. We know what the problems were with that bailout because we had oversight agencies tell us what went wrong with it. We had both an IG and the oversight panel that was administered by Elizabeth Warren before she was in the Senate. Now, those oversight panels were basically powerless. They could not stop any of the fraud or abuse that was going on, but they could report on it, and they did. And we have this record. It's very clear. And Congress essentially said, let's repeat that model. The 2008-2009 bailouts should be the model for the coronavirus bailouts. And I think that's just appalling. It's not only appalling for Democrats, it's appalling for progressives whose leaders didn't stand up and say, hey, we know how to do this right, and we're not doing it right. And of course, I don't have a whole lot of faith in President Trump or the Republican Party to stand up for workers instead of Wall Street. But still, it's possible that somebody on that side could have stood up and said something too, and nobody did.
Speaking to the last point, it was just reported in the news today that Trump removed the Pentagon official who was responsible for overseeing the relief effort, one of the inspector generals, and he's been doing that with inspector generals in other departments. James Clyburn said his oversight committee is just going to be looking at profiteering and price gouging. So do you have any confidence there will be sufficient oversight of the spending of these trillions of dollars by anybody in our government right now?
Well, I think the good news is that the person Chuck Schumer has talked about nominating to the oversight panel to look over this stuff is somebody who is quite good. It's a former staffer for Elizabeth Warren. He's the guy who basically ran her banking policy. He knows what he's doing. He's smart. He's quite good. The bad news is that Democrats don't seem interested in pursuing anything other than waste, fraud, and abuse. They're not interested in sort of a forensic look at how we got to this problem. They're not interested in both looking at the sort of technical economic reasons and the political reasons. You know, there were a series of decisions that were made by the Trump administration in January and February, which caused coronavirus to be a disaster in the United States. You know, you can't stop the existence of random, diseases from popping up in different corners of the world, but a decent testing regime in the United States was possible. They didn't put it in place. They did put one in place in other countries, and those countries have not had the type of calamity that we are now living through. None of this, shelter in place business would be necessary if we just screened people at airports for a while. If we'd had testing available in our medical facilities for a while. There are people in New York who probably were getting treated for the flu who had coronavirus for weeks. That's a disaster. But that said, I don't think there's much interest in the Democratic Party leadership right now of appearing to be in some sort of tension or controversy with the president. Particularly from Clyburn's statement over the weekend, he seems to want to show that the Democrats are cooperating with President Trump, that they're working together with him, that this is a big bipartisan happy family coming together to address the crisis. And I think you can see that reflected in the vote. Not many things passed Congress 96-0. The bank bailout didn't pass in 2008 or 2009 without people voting against it. The Democratic Party made a concerted effort to get everybody on board and to get everybody to yes. I think progressives didn't ask for enough, but I do think it's pretty clearly part of the strategy here to make it look like Democrats and Trump are getting along. I don't know how you do that and conduct oversight of administration that is clearly failing at the same time.
Right.
It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, we got some information from a call that Pelosi had with Democrats yesterday about what is to be in phase 4 of this bailout, replenishing funds from the last package, more direct payments, extended unemployment insurance, more money for food stamps, more money for small business, assistance to states and local governments, with an emphasis on communities with under 500,000 population. Schumer is talking about a fund for frontline workers, upping the pay of hospital, transit drivers, and grocery store workers by $13 an hour, and a $15,000 recruitment incentive for home and healthcare workers. Mitch McConnell wants to approve a payroll protection program increase, which is the program for small businesses, by unanimous consent tomorrow. What do you think of these ideas, and do you think they'll be enough?
Well, I mean, it all depends on the scope of these proposals, right? I mean, more money for states is a good idea. If you're putting $50 billion out the door, that's not going to cut it. I mean, you need trillions of dollars. Look at what's happening in New York. But that said, the problem is not just insufficient funds. Money will help, particularly at the state level. If you can continue to employ people through this crisis, that means they're getting paychecks. It also means they can do medically necessary work to actually stop the crisis. This crisis will not end until we deal with the virus and with the medical emergency. So it is good to get that money out the door, but it's not just a monetary problem. We have a production problem. We do not have enough doctors and nurses. We do not have enough medical equipment for the doctors and nurses that we have. We need to be talking about how to address the actual medical emergency in front of us. And that is a production problem. That's not just a monetary problem. And so the fact that Democrats are not talking about that yet, I still think is a problem. But that said, look, infrastructure, for instance, is something that Pelosi floated last week as well. A few $1 billion in infrastructure, some holdovers from previous requests that Democrats have had with negotiations with Mitch McConnell at sort of year-end budget talks. That's not going to cut it. But a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure initiative coupled with an effort to actually produce the things that we need in the United States, That is a serious proposal. You could call those both infrastructure. One of them is a joke, and one of them would actually address what we need. I think fundamentally, though, the production problem is so severe, we are looking at several months of time lag before that stuff can be off the ground. So in the meantime, you do need to have money going out the door to individuals so they can pay their bills. Even if they can't get access to, key supplies, they at least aren't going to get foreclosed on. They're not going to get evicted. They're not going to, lose their library card or whatever because they can't pay their overdue fees. The financial life goes on even when sort of material life comes to a halt. So I do think that's important. Whether Congress can actually do this, I just don't know. I think the Democratic Party squandered a lot of its leverage the first time around by agreeing to, essentially infinite money for corporate America.
Right.
Once Republicans have that, why would they give you all this other stuff for people that the party leadership has made quite clear they don't really care about?
What I've been noticing is that even though there are eviction moratoria right now in Los Angeles and California and probably in other states, people are saying that that's not going to be enough. They want a rent freeze. They don't want to have to pay the rent at some future point because they don't get their salary held. Because a lot of people are saying, well, we can't freeze the rents because mom and pop landlords still have to pay their mortgages. So if we don't pay the rent to them, they don't have the money to pay their mortgages. And I know a couple of mom and pop landlords who say this to me. So my thing is, if we're giving the banks 0% interest, why can't the banks in turn give the homeowners a elimination of the interest payment? We know that in the beginning of the mortgage, most of what you're paying is interest. And a lot of people say by the time they're done with their 30-year mortgage, they've paid for their house double and triple times what it would have cost them. So if the banks are getting zero interest on the money they get access to, couldn't we require them to not charge interest payments?
We could have. That Congress chose not to. There are all sorts of technical things you can do with the banking system. There's an enormous amount of federal oversight of the banking system, even without a bailout. But once you start saying, well, we'll throw infinite money out the door with no strings attached, there's no reason for banks to cut anybody any slack. Right. We saw that in 2008 and 2009. But there's nothing stopping Congress or the Federal Reserve or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency or the Treasury Department from requiring banks to do things that would be in the public interest. Whether it's a suspension of interest payments for the duration of the crisis, or even just Congress could buy up these loans from the banks themselves and just forgive them. There are all sorts of things that can be done. That they just chose not to do. Will they choose to do it in the next time around? I'm not optimistic. If you look at the small business program, for instance, this has kind of turned into like a fee harvesting program for banks. Like big banks that are offering small business loans are not taking on credit risk in this program. The federal government takes on credit risk. So if people don't pay back their small business loans, the banks don't take a hit. The government takes a hit. Banks are still charging enormous fees for these loans. That's the fees that they're charging are charged to the small businesses who need the money. So essentially, the banks are just dipping into the small business fund to feed themselves. I think that's going to be what you're going to see on the financial side of things. Yes, sure, we could make banks stop foreclosing on people. We could make banks stop charging people monthly payments. We could do all sorts of stuff, but I don't think Congress will do that.
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of those predatory lenders in the form of check cashing places and payday lenders are also continuing to charge their exorbitant fees during this period. Now let's talk about the ideal situation. Now you wrote a book on the economist John Maynard Keynes, the founder of what we know as Keynesian economics. Describe what Keynesian economics is and what do you think he would prescribe to deal with this crisis right now?
Well, describing Keynesian economics is a tricky business. I mean, I wrote a 600-page book about it, so and a soundbite, it's tough. I think one of the things that is most important about Keynes is that he believed that an economy that was built on escalating levels of income and wealth inequality was ultimately a fragile political entity, that you would not be able to avoid social upheaval and disasters like we're experiencing now if you allowed inequality to just get out of control. He probably had a different definition for out of control at the time than maybe we have now, but that was the basic idea. And so his economic project was built around finding ways to make the economy more responsive to the needs of ordinary people. I think in this crisis, we've talked a lot about, we've heard at least the phrase thrown around about wartime mobilization. I think that's the right concept. Keynes talked a lot about treating the Great Depression the way governments treated wars. Governments saw no problem before the Great Depression running up enormous deficits or printing enormous amounts of money, so long as it was to fight a war. And he couldn't understand why they wouldn't do that in peacetime to fight, an economic calamity. We should be doing that now. But in order to do wartime mobilization, Keynes was very focused on the movement of real resources and not just the movement of money. One of the reasons he wasn't so worried about deficits and told governments, it's fine to go ahead and run a big deficit to help yourself get out of a recession or a depression, is because he recognized that monetary figures and accounting figures like that were not necessarily reflective of what was going on in the real world with the movement of resources. So I think he would be talking about a sort of military scale commitment to training doctors and nurses, to producing medical equipment, to producing the essential, materials that we need to keep the economy moving. He'd be talking about large scale infrastructure projects to put people to work, particularly in the construction business. But he would also recognize that, a medical emergency where people can't leave their house for a pandemic is different from, say, the crisis we saw in the Great Depression. So you would have to take into account the fact that you don't want people to leave the house for a while. I think things like bill moratoriums and the like, making sure that people still have money in their pockets would have been an essential part of his program, but also the public side of things. The government's got to be the spender of last resort when ordinary people won't spend, which they're not going to do for a while. Keynes would have talked about a full-scale mobilization of society's resources against this pandemic directed by the federal government. I think he would have been disappointed by the approach that we're going to see instead.
That terminology of a wartime mobilization was used by Margaret Klein Salomon several years ago when she talked about climate mobilization to combat climate change. And then it was used by Jill Stein in 2012 when she was running on the Green New Deal. And then, of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez picked it up and all the presidential candidates picked it up. Naomi Klein, who wrote Shock Doctrine, is now talking about how we can use this crisis for positive things. Shock doctrine has been used for negative things in the past, but why can't we use it for positive things like a Green New Deal and also some big structural changes? I wanted to broach something with you because in reading about your feeling about the supply chains, it seemed to me that you were saying that if we only just made things in this country again, we could solve a lot of those problems. And I would like to put something forward to you for you to either, agree with or rebut, which is that it's more than just outsourcing. Listen, my family business that my grandfather started during the Great Depression, ironically, was manufacturing clothing. And they started out with sweatshops in the Lower East Side of New York. And then they moved down south, to escape union wages. They were paying minimum wages in the South. And then when NAFTA came around, my father, who at that point had several factories in the South, 3 different states, employed several thousand people, had to close his factories and fire all those people to move to maquiladoras in Mexico. And then when China joined the WTO in 2000, that wage became too expensive. And by that point, my sister was running the company and she was doing contractors in China. And as a single mom, she couldn't, keep going over there. So she shuttered a 3rd generation family business. So I know from the other side about outsourcing and these trade deals. But what I would like to say to you is even if we brought all the jobs back, we've had 40 years of neoliberalism in this country, which the way I define it, it's a philosophy that private industry can do things better, cheaper, faster, more efficiently. And I just don't think that's true because private industry is devoted to making profits. not providing a public good. And in many cases, and the healthcare industry is an example of that, they actually profit by denying that public good, denying healthcare. On their balance sheet, when they pay out a claim, it's called a medical loss. So it's extremely perverse, I think, to expect that a private industry or even these public-private partnerships that the neoliberals are so fond of are going to get us out of this mess. We really need, in order to go back to what you're talking about, the kinds of things that FDR did, we need to get rid of this whole neoliberal philosophy.
Your point about private industry being sort of incentivized to do the wrong things, not only in a crisis like this, but in the ordinary run of business, I think is something that a lot of people would agree with, including myself. Whether you need fully public institutions to counter that, it's not obvious to me. I mean, I think in some cases, yes, nationalized industries are important, are the right way to go. But FDR had a lot of success just regulating the hell out of things. The banking system for a long time didn't see financial crises, not because it was owned by the United States, but because it was really tightly regulated and there were very clear rules about what banks could or couldn't do. We started unwinding those rules in the 1980s, and we've started having financial crises as a result. So you can get the results you want from industry with good oversight and good rules, but you have to know what you have to devise those rules, and you have to take them seriously. On your point about trade, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's more to the manufacturing problem in the United States than offshoring, but it's caused largely by the global legal framework that is put in place by the types of trade deals the United States has not only implemented but pursued and sort of urged the rest of the world to take up over the last 30 years. It's not just individual deals like NAFTA or CAFTA. It's the entire framework of the World Trade Organization is designed to sort of reach beyond the nation state and say, okay, we don't want countries to regulate too much, to interfere with the movement of capital and businesses across different national boundaries. So we want to take away nations' abilities to regulate things in their own interests. The idea being that governments are corrupt and make bad decisions and will interfere with commerce in some way that is suboptimal. I think we do have to grapple with the fact in the United States, it's very clear, for instance, that our government has serious corruption problems, and our government is not unique in that respect. But when you take away the government's ability to regulate in the national interest, you leave yourself at the mercy of actors that have much narrower interests. And particularly in a democracy, the government is in many cases the only sort of avenue for public sentiment, for public accountability. For certain types of questions. So I do think you need to find ways to have the economy be more democratically accountable, whether that means the government owning things directly. I'm agnostic on that question. But right, I mean, it's been 40 years of this stuff. I think it will be difficult to unwind, but who knows? Things happen in a crisis that you can't predict, and I don't think anybody can say where we're going to be politically or economically in 6 months. We could have a whole different set of conventional wisdoms by then.
Well, I agree with what you said. I was the LA point person for all the actions fighting the TPP. And we talked about the investor state dispute clause that essentially made corporations more powerful than governments in that respect. And that is also why the right wing was against it. Jeff Sessions led the charge in the Senate from the right against the TPP. And I think that's one of the political advantages that Trump had when he was running 4 years ago, is that he was against the TPP. And Hillary, even though she tried to say she was against it, we all know that she touted it 45 times as Secretary of State. And then, of course, Obama was pushing it throughout the entire election season. And that's why I think so many of those Obama voters, stayed home in the Midwest. Of course, they like to blame Jill Stein. Going back to ideal things that we could get out of this, if we had anybody who had some vision and political will in our government, Naomi Klein wrote another book called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And she talks about how the globalization and all the shipping of these products uses so much fossil fuels, which are so damaging. And we see right now nothing is being shipped. We see people are not driving. We see the air being a lot cleaner. And it kind of makes me think about Code Pink. They've been talking about a localized peace economy. Can we get back to a localized economy where we actually grow things, we grow our own food, we build the things that we need? I mean, I was talking about this with somebody who's a little more conservative than me, and he said, are you willing to give up your iPhone? And I said, well, why can't we manufacture the iPhone in this country? And he said, it's not just a matter of manufacturing the phone, it's a matter of mining the rare minerals. So it's a very complicated question. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I do think that we need to go to a more localized economy and food production system, especially as the climate crisis gets worse. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, those rare earth minerals that you mentioned are a really interesting story. They're not just in smartphones, they're in stuff like, matches and light bulbs. And because we don't mine them anymore in the United States, if we have a light bulb crisis, which, I mean, we could have a light bulb crisis right now. It's not crazy to think about losing access to basic goods like that, and we can't make light bulbs anymore. That's a problem. Now, on the rare earth side, these questions, you mentioned localism, it's tricky because one of the reasons we don't mine rare earths anymore is because it's a pretty dirty business. And a lot of environmental activists had tried to basically get that out of the United States because it was polluting local areas. So, these questions are not always super easy to resolve. And there are trade-offs, but I do think, for instance, right now, the inability to produce a lot of goods that are made with rare earths, for instance, is going to be could very well be a problem over the next year or so. Certainly something that when people were talking about stopping that production, they weren't thinking about. On localism, like I said, it's hard for me to see where this is going. I don't know if we can get to a different kind of economy out of this. But I will give you this anecdote from Keynes's life. Toward the end of the war, he was not only World War II. He was sort of like a wartime Treasury Secretary in the UK at this point in his life, and he was in charge of all sorts of different initiatives for war finance. But one of the things he was in charge of was a sort of local council for the arts in Britain. He felt like people had been through this horrible experience of the war, and they needed to be able to access the good things in life, theater, opera, all sorts of performances. He said that the BBC's development over the course of the war had made very clear that, opera and fine arts weren't just for the super fancy rich people, that people all over from all different classes liked this stuff. And he wanted to make England and Great Britain a paradise for the arts. He wanted London to be a wonder of the world in performing arts. But he didn't just want this to be a thing for city folks. He had a line, let every part of Merry England be merry in its own way. He wanted the building of regional theaters, local theaters, the hiring of local actors and playwrights and directors and all of this, so that local culture could have a way to express itself. He recognized that just having something coming out of the capital in London wasn't going to be enough to satisfy the sort of cultural anxiety and tension that had built up over the course of the war. So I think that's an important sentiment to remember. We will come out of this crisis eventually in some form. What form that takes is difficult to envision, but we do have to remember that most people who pull through this will pull through because they have access to some sort of community, even if it's only realized digitally. And we need to find an outlet for those bonds when it's over.
Yeah, it's interesting because you were saying about consolidation of companies. I mean, the monopolization of our economy has been, I think, the biggest cause of wealth and income inequality. And it's something that Bernie Sanders did not address enough, which is strange because Matt Stoller had been on his budget committee and he's really the expert on that. One final question before I ask you what you're currently working on, and that relates to Medicare for all. So Bernie Sanders recently did one of his town halls, which of course the press is not covering. And he was saying that he's really going to be fighting very hard in this next package to make sure that Medicare covers all COVID-19 treatment. Now, he said in that same live stream that this was not the time or the bill to get Medicare for all passed. Now, what I'm wondering is, do you know any structural reason why it is not the time or bill to do it? Because I think, let's say he said, listen, I will drop out of the race right now if you institutionalize Medicare for all in this next bailout bill. Because what people are saying he should do right now, exact promises from Joe Biden or stay in to get enough delegates to influence the platform. Well, we know the platform isn't even worth the paper that it's printed on. And trying to extract promises from Joe Biden, who lies, and also who is backed by all these horrible corporations, that's not going to work either. So do you think this is something that Bernie Sanders could do and should do?
I don't think he can get Medicare for all passed in this crisis on the next bill, at least. To some extent, I think it's just because Congress is not interested in this. I mean, this would cause a significant hit. I mean, we just had a Democratic Party primary. The Democratic Party is the party that, you know, ostensibly should be more interested in this. And a lot of the primary was fought on whether or not people can keep their private health insurance. And most of the Democratic Party decided that they did not want Medicare for all, or at least the candidates who were advocating it. So I don't think Sanders has the support, even within the Democratic Party, to get something like that done.
70% of the people in the exit polls in the states that voted for Biden, 70% of those Democrats said that they supported Medicare for all. So I think they were voting for Biden for electability reasons, not for policy reasons.
Sure, they support. I think Medicare for all is something that's popular in the abstract of people, but when they vote, I mean, that's what matters. And they ultimately voted for people who were very clear about not supporting these ideas.
Now that people are losing their jobs, they don't have that employer insurance anymore. So don't you think times have changed just in the last month?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think all the arguments against Medicare for all have largely collapsed over the past week or two. I don't think they were very good to begin with, frankly. But clearly, I mean, people can see that you know, tying employment to healthcare is not a super good idea. But that said, I just don't think institutionally in Congress there's any momentum to do anything like that. I wish it weren't so, but I can't imagine that happening. The other problem here, though, is that access to care from patients is only one side of the problem that's being exposed by the coronavirus process. You know, it seems inhumane and wrong to deny people access to care because they don't have a job, for instance. I mean, that seems clearly bad. It's bad for public health. People can't get tested. They can't, you know, if you're sick, you don't know if you've got it. But even Medicare for all doesn't solve all of the problems that we're seeing. You know, you also can't get tested if there are no tests. You also can't get treated if your doctors don't exist or don't have masks. Medicare for all doesn't directly address those problems. So it may be easier to address them with a Medicare for all system or with something like the British National Health Service, where the government is overseeing the entire process. But you have to be able to not only give people access to healthcare, but also provision the healthcare itself. So that's a separate problem that needs to be addressed, you know, going forward.
Right.
I unfortunately just don't think Congress is interested in addressing either of them. So
well, that's why I asked you if you thought Bernie Sanders, who they're so desperate to get out of this race, they're so desperate, you know, if that would. Okay,
my dog agrees with you.
Listen, I know we're at the end of our time, so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to mention anything that I didn't ask you about, or maybe to tell people what you're working on, your next article, and also how they can follow you.
Yeah, yes, you can follow me at Zach D. Carter on Twitter. I've got an author page somewhere on HuffPost. ZacharyDCarter.com is my author page for the book. The next piece is on the sort of sense of despair in the Democratic Party. You know, I think it relates to what you were saying about Biden and how many Biden voters support essentially the economic program of either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. There's something wrong with the Democratic Party where Biden appears to have won the presidential nomination rather overwhelmingly, and yet has very little enthusiasm from his own supporters. I think something like only 24% in a recent poll said that he was, that of his supporters said they're very enthusiastic about him, which is a huge gap with President Trump, was somewhere in the 50s. That's bad. Aside from what might or might not happen in November, there's sort of a, I think, sense of hopelessness and fatalism among the Democratic Party, not just on the left, but even among just sort of people who don't think of themselves as particularly ideological or even kind of centrist, corporate-friendly folks in the Democratic Party. There's a view that things are always going to be bad, that our leaders have always done the best they can, and things really just can't get a whole lot better. The world is as good as it could possibly be, and I think that is a really dangerous attitude. It's more dangerous than a specific policy program that people might vote for or against, and it's a crisis for the Democratic coalition more broadly. It's not the establishment versus the insurgents. There's something wrong with the Democratic imagination right now, and that's a real problem if the party is supposed to be a party of progress and of making the world a better place and of change for the better.
Well, that's why you think there's little enthusiasm among the people who supported him. Wait till you see the enthusiasm of the Bernie supporters. I mean, I'm not voting for him. I'm going to vote for Howie Hawkins. I had him on my show. He's fantastic. My whole life since 1980, I've rarely voted for somebody who's won, because I'm not going to ever vote for the lesser of two evils. I'm going to always vote for, the person who represents the platform that I support. You know how Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. If we're in this incredible depression in November, a lot of people are saying that Trump cannot win. Yet right now we see his poll numbers rising, even among Democrats. We see the, Nancy Pelosi, as you say, and Schumer wanting to unite with him, or unite as a country, maybe not necessarily with him. I personally think that Biden is clearly undergoing cognitive decline, and it's shocking to me that they're even putting forth someone like this. I wouldn't put it past him to try to substitute out Cuomo. Do you think, with the country in a depression, that Trump can win?
Oh, I definitely think Trump can win with the country in a depression and with Biden as the nominee or with Cuomo as the nominee. I think simple sort of formulas to tell us, whether presidents are going to win, even when you can find a model that's held up for a long period of time, the models work until they don't. We've never been in a coronavirus crisis before. I don't think there's a whole lot that political science can really tell us quantitatively about who will or who won't win in November. If Democrats, botch the response as well, I don't think people are going to want to throw President Trump out. Right now, it's not clear to me that the country recognizes how badly the president has screwed this up. I think they sort of see it as a bad thing that happened that the president had to respond to, not a problem that the president had ignored for 2 months until it hit the United States. I mean, we could have prevented this. Other countries that took preventative measures prevented this from becoming a crisis on their shores. If Democrats can't turn that perception around, I mean, they're going to be in trouble. Trump is going to present this as him doing heroic things, and some of the economic facts just make it look like there's nothing he can do, right? I mean, the fact that we can't get access to N95 masks, for instance, because we don't make them here, that's not long-term Trump's fault. That's a problem with the global economic system that was built by both parties over the course of several years, and Trump will have a very easy rhetorical maneuver on that. He'll say, well, look, I did all the tariffs and I tried to change the trade deals, which will be not relevant for a lot of different reasons. But it's not obvious to me that Democrats are prepared for the kind of rhetorical maneuvers that are going to be necessary. And it certainly doesn't seem to me that they're interested in taking the steps as a matter of policy making that would be needed to turn this thing around. So I think it's totally possible that Trump could win. I think it's also totally possible he could lose. I mean, people could just say, look, he totally failed and thousands of people have died. I just don't know.
I think it is a failure of neoliberalism. Look, Obama did not replenish the stockpile after the outbreak in 2009. Jerry Brown actually dismantled our stockpile that Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger put together for just this sort of thing because of a budget deficit. And when the budget went back into surplus, he didn't replenish it. So, you know, we had all that equipment, those ventilators, those PPEs that we needed, and then we didn't have them. We sold them all off. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you so much for being on the show, and I continue to follow you and read all your excellent articles, and I hope that my viewers do too. I want to let people know that tomorrow I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Lara Fielding, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. We're going to be talking about how to cope in these uncertain times. On Thursday, speaking of Code Pink, I'm going to be interviewing Medea Benjamin and Leonardo Flores to talk about how the Trump administration is using this to go against Maduro and Venezuela, and maybe even try to start a war with Iran. So again, thank you so much, Zach, for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
All right, and thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting.